BBC Radio 1 Vintage.
Hello, this is Scott Mills on Radio 1 Vintage. Now, I don't really remember this, but back in the 90s, Radio 1 did comedy shows. To be more specific, at a time when household names like Simon Mayo, Steve Wright and Chris Evans were doing the breakfast shows, Radio 1 also decided that actual comedy programmes in their own right was something that it should be doing to serve its young audiences. And in the process, they put on air some of the newest and most innovative comedy writers and performers who went on to become household names and changed the face of British comedy. There were actually loads of comedy shows on Radio 1 that ran regularly from 1988 to 1996 and into the end of the decade. But in the next hour, we're going to look at the 4 biggest shows on Radio 1 that came to define their generation in the early and late 90s. The Mary Whitehouse Experience.
Aha, all right.
The Armando Iannucci Shows.
Sit down and start listening.
Leon Herring's Fist of Fun.
Fist of Fun.
And of course, Blue Jam.
Blue Jam.
They were some of the most creative, funny and daring shows Radio 1 has ever transmitted that made successful transitions from Radio 1 to TV and have become shows that have made a lasting impact on the history of comedy in this country. This is the story of Radio 1 comedy in the 90s on Radio 1 Vintage. We start at the beginning.
Picture this. A recording studio somewhere far, far away.
Say, kids, what time is it? It's time.
The Mary Whitehouse Experience. And in case any of you were wondering, I am Mary Whitehouse. And this is Punt and Dennis.
Well, half of them. Meet Steve Punt.
There was a very strong feeling amongst a lot of young comics that it was a shame that there was no comedy on Radio 1. Hugh Dennis and I did some sketches for Simon Mayo when he was doing the breakfast show. It was a Christmas thing. It was like, I think it was Nativity, which you normally have to be very careful with the Nativity. And it felt really cool to be on the Radio 1 breakfast show. So then in the mid-80s, cabaret-style comedy was very fashionable. And Radio 4 got in on the act. They realised what was going on. They put together a series called The Cabaret Upstairs, and Hugh and I had a little spot on that. And we were all going, oh, it's such a shame there's nothing like this on Radio 1. And then in 1988, Radio 1 decided they wanted a similar kind of show with a host and then guest comics and stand-ups on. And they made a series called Hey Radio, which was recorded at the Woolwich Tramshed, which was one of London's live from the Woolwich Tramshed.
Hey, 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 radio, hey, radio. What is it exactly? It's a comedy and music show.
What's it called?
It's called Hey Radio.
Sounds great.
Ready, steady, Hey Radio.
But the amazing thing about it was that it was hosted by Patrick Marber,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
who is now an Oscar-nominated screenwriter who started out as half of a double act and a comic, and he's on the early editions of Knowing Me, Knowing You with Alan Partridge. But he was the host. Amongst the people writing for him were David Baddiel and Rob Newman, who worked on it just as writers. And what happened was that they made 13 of these shows, and afterwards Radio 1 said, yeah, we quite liked Hey Radio, but the trouble is that it's always different voices every week. There's just this one host and everyone else is always different. What we think would be good is a similar show but with a regular team. So a producer called Bill Dare, who went on to produce Dead Ringers, quickly realised that that would mean people who could write. Because if it's the same people week after week, they've got to write enough stuff. So Bill realised that he was going to have to find people who were writers as well as performers. So he ended up asking 3 sets of 2, actually, because he asked David and Rob, and he asked myself and Hugh, and also a double act called Skint Video, who were musicians, and they would write topical songs. And then on top of that, there would also be a guest stand-up.
Right, the producer, Bill Dare,
Brother of Dan and Dr. Kill.
asked us to do something topical, so...
We contracted salmonella poisoning.
And in any case, we'd far rather talk about the weather. Long gone are the days when hurricanes blew across the southeast and the Oscar for worst weather forecast went to a fish called Michael.
The warm winter has also produced a plague of rats and slugs, most of whom are writing for Sunday Sport.
There were two brilliant things about being on Radio 1. The first was that it was a run of 13, but the second was that they moved really quickly. They listened to the pilot and they said, not only do we want a series of 13, but you can start in like 5 weeks' time.
That was a vote of confidence, especially as topical comedy was all still a bit of a gamble for Radio 1 and something quite new. But writers and performers Steve Punt and Hugh Dennis, alongside Rob Newman and David Baddiel, seemed to have it under control.
There were quite a few big events going on there. In fact, I can't remember if it was the pilot or a very early edition of the show, where we recorded the same week as the notorious Brit Awards with Mick Fleetwood and Samantha Fox. And I remember doing a load of jokes about that in the week it happened. So sometimes, you know, doing this kind of comedy, you will end up not remembering the event so much as remembering doing the jokes about the event.
And now we come to the Brit Awards, the only awards ceremony whose title is actually rhyming slang.
Mick Fleetwood proved that as a presenter, he is a tall drummer with a beard.
The hallmark of Hugh and I's style early on was to go very, very fast to leave no gaps for hecklers. And we'd became notorious, I think, for just going really fast.
But even though they were now on air, it was still a learning experience. Steve Punt again.
I watched David and Rob just reading out stuff and playing with the audience and having great fun doing it. And I gradually became less apprehensive about just sort of sitting back and enjoying it a bit, you know. Hugh is kind of specialised in funny voices. He's very good at accent. So he would do a lot of the politician voices or the sort of generic accents, Americans or any kind of British accent that you want.
All right, panel, the next round. I don't know what President Ceausescu fired at the protester, but it certainly wasn't a blank.
Rob was also very good at accents, and at that time was mainly an impressionist. So there are lots of impressions in the show, including Jonathan Ross, which I used to love Rob's Jonathan Ross, because it was mainly a noise. He used to go, all right.
All right, well, hello, my name's Jonathan Ross. All right. And, all right, thank you. And, all right. Well, flubba, lubba, 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 lubba. Flub, flub, flubbly, flub, flub, flubbly, flub, flub, flubbly, flub, flub, flubbly, flub, flub, flub. All right. Well, I've just dropped into the Mary Whitehouse Experience for you all to have a listen to this sound. That was the sound of me earning £1,000. All right.
Punt and Dennis were sort of known, but they realised early on that Rob Newman and David Baddiel were always going to be labelled as the cool kids.
Weirdly, we'd been involved for a couple of years with Jasper Carrott. So I think we were seen as the more mainstream and slightly more established act because we'd been on the telly. Whereas David and Rob, I think they'd done a lot of gigs, but I don't think they hadn't done much TV. So they were definitely the ones who the music press and the Time Out would focus on because they were new and cool, whereas Hugh and I were tainted by association with Jasper Carrott.
And now, the ageing, pain, illness, misery and death experience.
Old people are always talking about how everything used to cost a penny. We simply can't believe this. We think that in the 1930s, these people were just trying it on.
Hello, I'd like 1 to seat duck soup, please. Here's a penny.
What?
Here's a penny.
Are you taking the piss? It's £6 for screen one.
Oh, all right then. Here you are.
No, that's a penny. And it's an old penny as well.
Is it? Oh dear.
Oi, Mr. Grimethorpe, someone here's trying to palm me off with a penny.
Oh, no, it's not that bloke with the goofy teeth in the feather duster again, is it?
Presumably, if everything did cost a penny, the money markets must have been very dull.
And now on March the 15th, 1910, the time is 6:17, City News. Dealers were shocked today as Longrow shares moved up to a penny, with ICI holding steady at a penny. And Allied Lions, after all this initial excitement, closed at a penny.
Sports news. Stanley Matthews has finally agreed the transfer terms offered to him by Blackburn Rovers and has moved there for a record penny.
I definitely felt that because the show was on Radio 1, it wasn't paid as much attention to as it would have been if it had sat on Radio 4 with those sort of censorious people listening. It got away with a lot of stuff because the audience were not offended by that kind of thing.
Another famous instrument of wartime radio propaganda was Lord Haw-Haw. He was a British bloke who broadcast Nazi propaganda to demoralise us. He could have been worse, though. He could have been Gary Davis.
And a big hello to Tracy, Sean, Tony and Baz, who are working at the munitions factory in Stepney. And now it's time for Gary's treacherous bit in the middle. That Adolf Hitler, isn't he a great bloke? He's young, free and Nazi. Anyway, next week the Luftwaffe Roadshow will be visiting Coventry and we'll be playing bits and pieces.
Now, maybe we should have more right-wing propaganda on the BBC. It would keep Norman Tebbit happy and it might be quite fun.
And it's Zeke-Hal from me.
And it's Seagull from him. Seagull.
Now, most people of a certain age probably remember the Mary Whitehouse Experience from being on TV. It ran on BBC Two in January 1991 for 6 episodes, and then again in 1992. And some of the best material from the radio show transferred across well.
What the TV show added, which we were only able to do to a limited extent on the radio, was some music-based jokes that I think were some of the most memorable things. I think Dave and Rob's Pet Shop Boys. I still can't hear the Pet Shop Boys without thinking of Rob standing at the back of his keyboard shouting, "Neil! Neil!"
Double cross you.
Neil? Neil? Do you want to do the keyboards for a bit? And I thought I might sing the next verse.
It's hard not to with the things I could
Neil?
tell me.
Neil! You want to take over back here and I'll come up to the mic, you know, at the front. I mean, I was talking to the ugly one in Tears for Fears and, you know, he gets to sing a bit, you know.
As the show got more popular, in addition to pulling in the audience for comedy, it probably eventually pulled people over to Radio 1 who maybe didn't normally listen. So it was just very sort of exciting all round, really.
Tim Worthington is author of Fun at One, a book about the history of Radio 1 comedy in the 90s.
Well, the Mary Whitehouse Experience really changed the rules of radio comedy completely. At the same time as it was very controversial and a lot of newspapers took against it, it was also such high quality that it was easy for the BBC and for people who liked it to defend. There'd never really been that kind of mania, that kind of following for comedy shows before. That was really the first, if we're being honest about it, to have that kind of, not just a cult following, but almost like a rock group audience. And there was a saying around that time, comedy is the new rock and roll. And that phrase belongs to the Mary Whitehouse Experience. They began that and they changed everything.
But what about the rumours that the two teams of writers were being overly competitive?
It was pretty obvious that there was a little bit of competition going on for... Dave and Rob did a really funny bit this week. We've got to write something funnier next week. Because the thing that often comes up with the show is the alleged friction is hugely exaggerated by the media, particularly from later. The radio shows were actually, not only were they great fun, but we got on really well. And if you listen to the radio shows, you'll find that we're all in each other's bits. And the whole show, although we wrote in teams, the whole show is very much a group thing.
The thing I remember about the Mary Whitehouse Experience is that the two most famous sketches that came from it, History Today and Milky Milky, weren't actually in any of the Radio 1 shows. They came later on the TV version. But the original Radio 1 show laid down the basic structure of the Mary Whitehouse Experience that we all remember today. How does Steve Punt feel about it now, looking back?
It feels like a show that we managed to scoop up all the best things about what alternative comedy had done and plonk them all into one show with some of the best things of more traditional comedy as well. It wasn't sort of radical alternative manifesto, but it was just, here's the good bits of alternative comedy with the good bits of old-fashioned comedy.
I'm Scott Mills. This is the story of Radio 1 comedy in the 90s on Radio 1 Vintage. We know Armando Iannucci as the guy who brought us Veep, The Thick of It, and created Alan Partridge. But back in March 1993 and 1994, he had his own comedy show on Radio 1.
Hello, sit down and start listening.
Tim Worthington again.
Well, if you don't remember the Armando Iannucci show from the first time around, it was basically him turning the whole idea of being a Radio 1 DJ on its head.
Armando Iannucci on 1FM. Imagine Johnny Walker jumping out of a cake.
No corner of Radio 1 was safe from him making fun of it, whether he was playing in the news from news he'd recorded on his bedside clock radio, whether he was doing spoof jingles that actually were so convincing that you probably would have thought they were a real thing. Everything he did was just gently but viciously subverting everyone else on Radio 1.
It was the year of the 1992 general election. But what was the year?
Armando Iannucci.
My first proper job was as a radio music presenter on Radio Scotland, simply because I sent a tape of funny stuff that I did, and they were looking for people to bring a bit of humour to their shows. So they gave me the job of co-presenting a young person's radio show with Eddie Mair and me. And how wisely they chose, two of the unhippest people ever. But what was great about it was I was just allowed to run around the building, use sound effects, use music, get other people in. If I wanted to do like a parody of a sports commentary, I could get the people who do sports programs and get the mics that they use, the special mics that go over their mouths, when they're doing horse racing. So it all sounds like that because it's very close up to you, so that you can't get any of the sound of the wind. All that business. So it was a real good training ground for doing comedy. And as a result of that, I then wrote to the BBC down in London, who were looking for some comedy producers, went down for an interview and got the job. So I ended up producing some shows that I kind of grew up listening to.
Morehouse, hello.
Oh, hello. It's the Inland Revenue here. I'm afraid you owe us £10,000.
Yeah, who's speaking?
I'm sorry, you saw right through it. It's Armando Iannucci.
Sorry?
It's Armando Iannucci.
Sorry, I'm sure you've got the wrong number.
No, it's from 1FM. Armando Iannucci from Radio 1.
Yes, do you know, what do you want to talk about, sir?
Oh, sorry, we just thought we'd try out one of these kind of joke phone calls that they do on the radio. But, sorry, it doesn't seem to have worked.
Well,
sorry.
Trying to remember how I ended up on Radio 1 as me. I had produced On the Hour, I produced Knowing Me, Knowing You. I'd done, within the BBC, I was known for doing funny speeches at BBC events. I think that was probably it. It's like a school, really, isn't it? It's like, it's how you get a part in the school play. If you're loud enough for the rest of the year, the teacher will go, yeah, you can be on it. So I remember badgering Johnny Burling, controller of Radio 1 then, saying, I've done, the Mary Whitehouse Experience, picked up awards, and Loose Talk was working well. And so I said, look, I want to do something. I've done comedy before on Radio Scotland. I want to do something that feels Radio 1. It feels live and loose and has lots of elements to it. It's got jingles and is sort of kind of parodying that world, but actually using it just really as a bed on which to introduce stupid jokes and having a little bit of a zoo format going on with getting Lee and Herring in and just trying to listen to the rhythms of what was going on in Radio 1 during the day and then trying to twist them a bit in the show.
Now then, do you want to take part in some of the most complicated competitions ever mounted on radio, including postal tennis, five-a-side facts, football, and Shout Wrestling? If you do, then send me your name, address, your fax number and your phone number, especially your fax number and your phone number, to me, Armando Iannucci, Radio 1, blah, 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 Radio Times.
We were still doing stuff on tape. So you were physically cutting tape and sticking it together, doing a cut and paste job on tape. And a lot of those shows, and a lot of the stuff I did on my own Radio 1 shows involved that re-editing stuff, cutting up a bit of Simon Bates to do a kind of multi-purpose hour tune and that kind of thing. But it was physically cutting it up through the night. And again, at the time, you know, everything was in the one building. So as long as you had your BBC ID, you could get into every room. It was before people had thought of things like security or long hours and limits on that. So I do remember being in the Radio 1 building at night, wandering around, going through John Peel's office at night. I mean, it was great, actually. And just going into the edits and just playing around, just seeing what we could come up with.
Here's one, the very best of our tune. It's a collection of the very best of Simon Bates' Our Tunes, compressed into 90 one-minute long bite-sized chunks. And here's one of the best of them.
I'm talking sense. Here's a letter from a lady who lives in the south of England by the name of Richard, who's a fella. And one day, without any warning at all to the kids, Richard's mum got up and announced that she was a gorgeous baby boy, perfect in every way. It was also a complete shock to Richard, and he was very young, he was 12 or 13 at the time. They started going out together and things were good. And mentally, what he did to cut off the hurt was to go back up north with a fella. And so fairly grudgingly, her mother-in-law had died peacefully in her sleep that morning. But she was just overjoyed. On the 21st of April last year, Julie gave birth to Richard and his sister, his mum and his dad. Outside the church, Richard's mum made a beeline for him, 300 miles away. She was just so brave. That's the story.
Just where I lived, I could just pick up... I'm a very bad sleeper, and I listened to the radio at night, and I could just pick up BBC Berkshire. I didn't live in Berkshire. I lived at the time in Buckinghamshire. But we got elements of BBC Berkshire bleeding through in the airwaves. And what I liked about BBC Berkshire was the same newsreader did major international news as well as local news. And I thought, oh, good, because then you can mix them together.
So what we're about to play is one of a selection of offerings from Radio Berkshire, giving them their unique Berkshire insight on the world, all taped off my bedroom cassette recorder radio.
Newbury District Council's reconsidering its proposals to prevent cars from parking in the heart of the town, after fears that businesses could be forced to close by the scheme. The deal was hammered out over 4 days of talks in Washington. The council wants to improve the appearance of the marketplace and says one option is to force shoppers to park outside the area, leaving it free for pedestrians. The US Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, pledged American support.
If an overall settlement can be reached, the United States stands ready to assist in the reconstruction of these sadly war-torn lands.
But retailers say this could cause shoppers to drive to other towns with more centrally placed car parks.
More international Berkshire news later, but now it's time for Mary with the texture of walnuts.
We'll never know what Mary had to say. Yeah, taped off my own... But then that's what you do. That's what you did when you were growing up. You just taped stuff off the radio, and you were into comedy. You would do stupid stuff with your tape recorder and do voices and cut stuff up and so on. So it was bringing that element of amateurism to a professional news outlet like and a professional music outlet like Radio 1. In the end, it's the more amateur it sounds, but using professional equipment, the better and funnier.
Armando Iannucci on 1FM. Sex with Transistors.
Nine Inch Nails' new album, The Downward Spiral, out today. That's Mr. Self-Destruct, the first track on it. Don't go any further. The rest is rubbish. Throughout the programme, we're going to be providing you with information on all the pieces of music we're playing, provided by the graphics department of ITV's The Chart Show.
9 Inch Nails are a fraud. There are, in fact, only 8 of them.
9 Inch Nails used to be known as Rula Lenska. Their new name comes from reversing the lead singer's name, Trent Reznor.
The lead singer of 9 Inch Nails recently spent all his money on footballs.
Get Josh Factors off our lawn.
End of March, beginning of April 93, I did 2 half-hour shows and then came back with an enhanced slot about a year or so later, I did 4 hour-long shows, and they were live. And so we had Peter Bainham in, and Stuart Lee and Richard Herring, and Rebecca Front was in, and could do phone calls and so on. And it was good fun, actually.
Most of the performers that Armando brought to Radio 1 had all worked with him before as writers or performers, either on Radio 4 for On the Hour or Weekending, or even on other Radio 1 comedies, such as Loose Talk. So they were already a tight-knit group.
Armando Iannucci on 1FM. He's got music coming out of his trousers.
That's me, these are my trousers, and time now to meet this week's blind date posse. Contestant number 1, name yourself and say where you're from.
Hi, I'm David Schneider from Crouch End, and if it's comedy you want, then you've come to the right place.
Well, if I get things back to front, it's because I'm Rebecca Front, and I'm from London.
Yay!
I'm Peter Bainham, I'm from Wales, and like Dylan Thomas, a Welshman, I'd like to put milk under your wood.
I'm Richard Herring, and I'm from Cheddar. So say cheese, because I am gorgeous, and I've got some sets of badges.
Okay, and also to celebrate British Science Week, we've got a scientist with us this evening. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Armando.
Hi, more from Ben later.
Armando was presenting these shows on Radio 1 at the same time as writing legendary news parody TV show The Day Today. How does it feel listening back to his Radio 1 shows almost 25 years later?
Looking back at them now, I hope they stand up. I don't know if they've dated or not. I mean, I was pleased with them. I was pleased, especially the hour-long ones, actually. I felt we were pushing at something that hadn't yet happened on Radio 1. And, you know, unfortunately, I then went straight into doing some television, which then takes up every waking hour just to make. And I would have loved to have gone back and done more of them, really, because these shows grow and you get more adventurous the more you can do. You know, if it was like a 20-part series, you know, the 20th episode would be a totally different in tone and feel from the first one. You can just still hear us being quite tentative in those early ones. But we all went off and did telly, so we didn't get back to do more, which is a shame.
This is Scott Mills, and it's the story of Radio 1 comedy in the 90s on Radio 1 Vintage.
Attention. At this moment, you are now listening to
a Radio 1 show.
If you are offended by words like
poo, wee, bum,
ass,
ias, orake, garden sieve,
dirty
pants,
dirty low tramp,
oh, I think that's going a bit far,
whatever, take the tape out now. This is not a pop album. And by the way, suck my mother...
homemade toffee.
Fun. Fist of fun. Fist of fun. Fun. Fist. Lee and Herring's Fist of Fun.
Coming to you from the Pleasance Theatre, Edinburgh.
On a Tuesday night in October 1993 at 8:30 p.m, a comedy duo would unleash themselves onto Radio 1 for the very first time.
Hello, I'm Stuart Lee, and I am called Richard Herring, and welcome to Lee and Herring's Fist of Fun.
Fist of Fun.
Yeah, that's right, Fist of Fun, a comedy show which, like most others, takes a broadly topical and wryly humorous look at what's going on in the crazy world around us each week, but with the original comedy twist of coming from the blinkered perspective of two emotionally stunted and slightly odd blokes in their 20s who live in separate but equally unpleasant rented accommodation in South London, have no proper jobs or interests, never read newspapers and watch a lot of daytime television, and therefore have no real idea of what's going on in the real world at all.
Here's Richard Herring.
I'd met Stuart Lee at university, and we'd sort of clicked in terms of the comedy. There was a comedy club there, and we didn't really like what anyone else was doing, so we decided to work together. And we sort of did some student shows, and we decided to come to London to see how we'd get on doing stand-up and writing for the radio. So we basically started writing together for a Radio 4 show called Weekending, which we did not enjoy. We did it for about a year. It was a very kind of trad and quite formulaic topical comedy show that lasted for a long time and launched a lot of great writers as well. But I remember one week I was so frustrated by having to come up with jokes about John Major being grey and liking peas, that I hid in some crates in the writing room that newspapers usually went in and refused to come out. I did come out, though, eventually. And out of that, Armando Iannucci was the producer one week, and he sort of enjoyed what we'd written, and he was like, for about an 8-week period, he tried to turn it round a bit. And then, having done that, he then worked on a show called On the Hour, which he asked us to come and write for. And out of that, we were sort of submitting our own shows. We did a show called Lionel Nimrod's Inexplicable World, which was a sort of parody of those shows that look into the supernatural, like Arthur C. Clarke's sort of world, where we just did sketches and a sort of double act. We weren't really quite a double act yet. And they repeated some of those on Radio 1, and the Radio 1 people liked what we were doing, and we were young, and that made us relatively cool in the light entertainment department of the BBC. So they kind of asked us to do Fist of Fun, which was, as far as I recall, mainly recorded on the road. So we would go to universities as young people recently out of university ourselves. We would go to universities and put on a half-an-hour show.
Fist Fact. When Fist of Fun first started broadcasting way back in October 1993, a first-class stamp cost 24p. It is now 25p. What a different place the world is thanks to Fist of Fun.
The format was just about stuff that we were doing. I think we sort of vaguely had this idea that it was Why Don't You for adults, which was a way to sort of the slacker generation, how you would fill your time. So I think that's what was the idea behind it. But we just basically went around universities doing, I think we did a couple of series of it, and they put those out on Radio 1, which was kind of interesting and amazing.
Supermarket Sweep has got more excitement than the 10 a.m. local weather forecast, more brains than the Playbus wide bird stop, and significantly more groceries in it than Kilroy.
And it is my best programme at the moment. You know how I said to you a couple of weeks ago that when I am at the checkout and I do hear that beep, the sad thing is I do start trying to imagine the fun I could be having on Supermarket Sweep. Well, it's actually got worse. Now I've started thinking about Supermarket Sweep when I hear any beep. At Pelican crossings, in lifts, on my Game Boy, In fact, I have started thinking about Supermarket Sweep when I hear any sound at all now.
You, Rich, are a victim of the hypnotic powers of Dale Winton. Only Dale himself is able to break the curse by using his powers to stop beeps making you think of Supermarket Sweep.
Yeah, well, that's very helpful, Stu, isn't it? Like Dale Winton's going to suddenly turn up at Greenwich University.
Well, Rich, it's funny you should say that. Because look who we've got here, it's Dale Winton.
Dale, I don't believe it.
Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Now, Richard, listen. Next time you're at the checkout or anywhere that you hear the beep or any sound at all, don't think about the fun you could be having on Supermarket Sweep.
Great, I'm cured. Thanks very much.
Stu and I had been writing together for a few years, and we'd met Peter Bainham, who we really liked. He used to work in the Merchant Navy, could drive a super tanker. He is now writing films in Hollywood, so it's quite a trajectory for him. On the circuit, we met Kevin Eldon, the actor Kevin Eldon, and I think we just sort of realised we'd found, both in him and Peter especially, but also people like Sally Phillips and Rebecca Front and various other people, we sort of kind of gelled with Kev, I think, more than anyone. But yeah, it was literally that we liked him and he was happy to come to Exmouth. I think we were doing that gig at, and the rest is history.
Lee and Herring's Fist of Fun.
And out of that, we've got another Radio 1 show called Lee and Herring, which was more of a DJ show.
Lee and Herring on 1FM.
The delicious break from potatoes, now in 6 fabulous flavours.
Oh yes, that's right. I'm Stuart Lee.
And I'm called Richard Herring. Great to be back on 1FM.
Yes, it's quite good. Happy
New Year to all our listeners, one and all. Peter's with us as well. Hi, Pete.
Hello.
He's called Peter now, not Peter Bainham, to avoid confusion with that other guy on the Chris Morris Show. Had a good Christmas, Peter?
Yeah, I got a card.
Oh, that's one
yeah.
whole one.
It's from the Raj Bilash Tandoori in Streatham, yeah. I didn't know they liked me.
This is 11th Dream Day from a new album, Ursa Major. This is called Bearish on High.
Then Fist of Fun transferred to the TV, where it became a bit more sort of formulated, I suppose. But yeah, it was that was how it happened. We spent a lot of time watching daytime TV. It's basically me. I'd go around to Stu's house, or when sometimes we lived in a flat to begin with, And even when we were working, we would stop and watch Neighbours. We'd sometimes watch Neighbours twice a day, and then we'd watch whatever came on after Neighbours. And we got quite obsessed with Supermarket Sweep. It was interesting with Dale because I think it was the first. I think that might have been the first episode. And he came on and he was sort of backstage. He was quite depressed, going, "Oh, I'm not, I think I've made a terrible mistake doing Supermarket Sweep." We were going, "No, it's brilliant." So, and then he came on and the kids went insane for him. And I think it was almost at that moment he realised within that half an hour that everything was going to be okay for Dale Winton. So it was really nice, and he was really good fun.
Fist of Fun.
They were pretty in tune with what students were into, including a certain legendary kids' TV show.
There have been a lot of important things that have happened in the last 6 weeks, but for me, the most terrible tragedy has been that Rainbow is returning, but Jeffrey from Rainbow is not going to be in the series, which I think is ridiculous, isn't it? Stuart, perhaps we can do something about it, can't we? Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome here tonight, Jeffrey from Rainbow!
Jeffrey was I remember him, slightly sadder individual, really. I think, he was... I think he had just been sacked, hadn't he, that week? So he was literally quite depressed.
Thank you.
Hello, Jeffrey from Rainbow.
Hello, Rich.
Before we go on, I've always wondered, who is it who dreamt up the amazing sort of surreal concept of Rainbow?
What do you mean, Rich? It wasn't dreamt up by anybody. No, it was, in fact, TV's first fly-on-the-wall documentary series. I first met Zippy George Lambungle back in 1971 at art school. And we decided to rent a place together, just to save on the living expenses.
Didn't you think at the time, Jeffrey from Rainbow, that, Zippy, George and Bungle were a bit odd, weren't they?
Stu, baby, this was 1971, remember? Things were really wild back then. We found a nice, cheap place in Lubbock Grove, and one day a TV producer friend of mine came round. He said, what an amazing combination of personalities. We ought to put this on the telly, Well, we thought he was balmy. I mean, who'd be interested in an ordinary man, a bear, a pink hippo, and a sort of zip mouth thing? But guys, it did work. And for 20 years, the camera crew would come round about midday, set the cameras rolling, and, whatever we were doing that day, that would be the day's show.
Didn't you have any human friends, Jeffrey?
Of course I did, yeah. Well, not strange or anything. Well, no, don't forget, there was Rod, Jane and Freddie. They were living in the flat downstairs. Well, they're only living together to save on their living expenses,
It's slightly tinged with tragedy. I mean, it's just a man who'd been on Rainbow for 20 years as well, it's not... I mean, this is show business, and I'm in no position to make any comment. But it's there was sort of an element. There was a lot of cruel comedy around at that time, and a lot of cruel comedy that came out later than that was sort of sneering. And I think mainly we managed to avoid that, and we were sort of celebrating these people in a slightly arch, with Supermarket Sweep, it's slightly like, isn't this a bit naff? But aware that we're adding to the legend of it. So I think, again, with Rainbow, that was the idea with Jeffrey Hayes.
You are now listening to
a Radio 1 show.
Like all good comedians, they weren't averse to writing material based on their everyday lives.
I learned to drive when I was about 26. I'd been very nervous about driving, and I was a very childish person. I kind of sort of things like drinking coffee and driving a car as being grown up, and I wanted to stay being childish and puerile. And I was scared of driving, so I had driving lessons quite late, but I ended up having about 100 driving lessons with this guy, and then I would do my test and passed with flying colours because I was amazing at driving because he'd given me way too many lessons. So, and he was a bit like, do you know how this works? I go, no. I go, well, don't you know that? I go, no, I don't know how to drive. So there was a little element where he would show off and what he knew about driving, belittle me for not understanding about driving.
My first pupil today is Rebecca. There is a simple procedure to follow when pulling your vehicle away from the curb. It is known as the pulling away from the curb procedure. And it goes like this. Mirror, signal, road ahead. Mirror, road. Indicate, mirror, road, mirror, mirror. Road, road, wing mirror, indicate off. Mirror, road, mirror, mirror, indicate signal road. Then one final check of the mirror and the road, and then pull away from the curb. All right, Rebecca? Or if you prefer, you can remember it by this simple acronym. Mizrum, rim, rum, ream, meom, rum, isrum, paftk. Okay, let's try that then. Come on, quickly, the time is now. Do it, come on.
Okay, mirror signal road, mirror road, indicate road.
What are you doing? What are you doing? You went mirror signal road, indicate road. It's mirror signal road, indicate mirror road. Mizrum rim rum rim me om mizrum pafke. Were you listening? It's easy. Mizrum rim rum rim me om mizrum pafke. Don't you even know that yet? My nephew Chris knows it already and he's only 16. How old are you?
I'm 28.
28? Oh dear, oh dear. Can't you even drive yet? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool?
No.
Well, why can't you drive then, eh? You can't even drive. It's a bit grey today, isn't it?
Things like that, where you're just taking stuff from life and working out where they go, you know. And there's lots of characters in Fist of Fun, you know, that it's sort of weird. There are lots of things around us broke through and became very mainstream. And the Fast Show was at the same time, and obviously Little Britain was to follow on from us. You know, Peter Dibdin was one of the things that felt like it would go. Simon Quinlank, which Kevin Eldon did.
Hello, it is I, Simon Quinlank, the Grand Wizard of Hobby, and my speaking voice is coming out of my mouth through your radio speakers and into your listening ears once again after a 9-month radiophonic absence. Do you like hearing my voice again? Do you? Good.
We were very obsessed, and this was before the internet, but about very obsessive people. There was lots of fanzines of people like Janet Ellis from Blue Peter, just like over a line, but that you wouldn't be able to be sent to prison for it. But basically it was the internet on photocopied paper. So Simon Quinlank was just a hobby guy who wanted to be the best at hobbies beyond all reason and invent his own hobbies. And he had another guy called Neil Petark who was also thought he was good at hobbies and he wanted to be better than him. And so it was just this very intense character. As Kevin played him, you know, I think we probably created this character out of this fanzine guy, and then Kevin turned him into this borderline serial killer guy who had lived in an attic and went out and did these insane hobbies.
I have returned to regale you with another hobby from my metaphorical bottomless well of hobbies. What you will need for today's hobby: a pen, pencil, felt tip, crayon, or charcoal stick; a pad or loose leaf binder; a minor TV celebrity; a flask of weak lemon drink; and the ability to stand waiting. This hobby is a good hobby if you like standing outside in all kinds of weather and having brief social contact with the whole host of minor TV celebrities who you have a secret disdain for. This hobby is called the telling a minor television celebrity that you think they're really great and asking for their autograph, and then when you have got their autograph, ripping up the autograph in front of the minor television celebrity's astonished minor television celebrity's skin-covered face hobby. This is a better hobby than just collecting autographs, which is a boring hobby. Plus, people who collect autographs are usually a bit strange or obsessive or mad, so you do not want to be like them.
The Fist of Fun sort of ethos probably coagulated more in the Lee and Herring show, which was where we tried out sketches and characters, and that's where the Rod Hull character sort of formulated out that just because Kev had a cold one day and so couldn't do a Rod Hull impression, and then it became him doing a Rod Hull impression going, I am Rod Hull, when it was nothing like him. So, you know, a lot of it was just quite organic.
97 to 99 FM, Radio 1.
And we got another caller on the line. Who's on the line now? Hello?
Hello?
Who's that?
It's Rod Hull.
It's Rod Hull? What's your question?
Yes.
Who do you want to ask?
Angry.
What do you want to ask question?
I want to know why you say I'm in the studio when clearly I am not. I'm at home in my pink windmill. With Emu.
How
dare you! Anyone can tell I'm the real Rod Hull! You only need to look at my straw hair! Shut up! And my pointed chin! Stop it! And listen to my screeching voice! I am Rod Hull, not you! I challenge you to a Rod Hull duel! Emus at dawn on Waterloo Bridge! I'll see you there! Not me, not you! All right!
Is the pink windmill in Hextable, then, it says on here? Well, okay.
Yes, that's right.
Is it good? Well, thanks, Rod.
Thanks for ringing in,
If
Rod.
that was you.
You know, again, that was just the right meeting of material and performer, you know, and I think it was good that we were very open to having other people in our stuff if they could do it better than we could.
Lee and Herring on 1FM, fighting the weak.
It did really feel like Fist of Fun could become something big, and I think I would have liked it to at the time, obviously, but I am, in hindsight, I'm quite glad that it didn't. There's always a part of you think, you know, it'd be nice. You know, it's interesting coming back and talking about it 25 years on, whatever, you know, there's still an interest in it, which is for a comedy show is quite rare, and often like a bigger show will become big and sort of explode and collapse in on itself. And I think there's a sort of purity to Fist of Fun because we never really got the chance to wreck it. So it's still quite fondly remembered by the people who remember it.
Well, the show's nearly over, and it's time for you and I to get into our big comedy bed and go to sleep until next week's show. Come on.
Oh, no, I'm not getting into bed with you.
Come on, there's nothing funny about it. Comedy partners have been getting into bed with one another at the end of their shows for centuries.
All right, off to sleep now, comedy actors. Bye.
Fist of Fun.
This is Scott Mills, and you're listening to the story of Radio 1 comedy in the 90s on Radio 1 Vintage.
Radio 1 Vintage. You're listening to Radio 1 Vintage. And up next, it's me, Marianne Hobbs. See you in about 20 minutes.
Radio 1 Vintage. Now, the following part of the show contains adult themes, content, and very strong language that some people might find offensive. So if that's you, there's loads of other amazing Radio 1 Vintage shows on the BBC iPlayer radio app. Right now, we step into the world of Chris Morris and Blue Jam.
He'd had the Chris Morris Music Show on Radio 1 in 1994, which was a more traditional sort of DJ comedy show, but Blue Jam was completely different, not just to that, but to pretty much anything that had ever been on the radio or that had ever been really attempted in the name of comedy. It was completely its own thing from the outset, and it really did confuse people.
When you fruit sack, be boot sack, vam kick sharp in gob, while you wish satsuma. When oo hands be warm, but only due a raging infect of the blood and the skin and the nail and the bone and the tissue, bacteria, ooh la la rouge. Well, so look at you, screaming and shouting like an angry turnip, you fucked up ridiculum, most foolin' to yourself, and I have no sympathy, oop turnip. And when all your remaining joy hides unnoticed in one shriveled cell at the bog bottom of the very bum tube of East Joffy, then welcome. Ooh, fudge, welcome. In Blue Jam, Blue Jam, Blue Jam.
Although Chris Morris had been making TV, a chance encounter with Radio 1 controller Matthew Bannister led to something very special.
I was walking through Soho on my way to a lunch, and I met him in the street, and I said, "Oh, I haven't seen you for a bit. What are you up to?" And he said, "Well, I'm creating a programme that is like the nightmares you experience when you fall asleep listening to the BBC World Service at night." And I thought, well, that sounds really good. I said, well, I'd really like to hear that, Chris, because I think that's something that we should have on Radio 1. And so, to a certain extent, I was prepared. To a certain extent, I knew it would be out of left field, and I knew it would be strange. But I don't think I was prepared for... I mean, the feeling I had when I first listened to it was one of sheer exhilaration, because it was like somebody's created something new in radio. And I know that sounds like a banal thing to say, but people don't create things new in radio, hardly at all ever.
And so, Blue Jam was born. It first went out in a series of 6 shows on Radio 1 at midnight into Friday morning in November and December 1997. It was a game-changing, genius mix of dark sketches and mostly ambient and carefully selected electronic music. Armando Iannucci again.
The atmosphere the music brings to it is as important as the dialogue, and that's what I like about it. The fact that, yes, it's funny, it's comedy, but because it's comedy, there's always a kind of temptation, if you think something's a comedy, to see it as slightly less important or less central than something that is straight. And actually, he's sort of saying, no, all the elements of this are part of the comedy. You know, the production is part of the comedy, making the production funny. It's very easy to sound very wanky talking about it, as I am now. So I'm going to stop being wanky.
Come in. Oh, that's
Come sit down. What can I do for you?
I've got a sprained knee.
Ah, yes. Football?
Yeah, it's pretty funny way it's going.
Painful there?
Yeah, very.
Yes, right. Well, what I'm going to do is give you 200 quid. £200, and I don't want to see you again.
You?
Okay.
Right, thanks very much.
Not at all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Former Radio 1 DJ Mary Ann Hobbs is a Morris fan and even featured him in The Mix on her late-night show The Breeze Block. One of the things around Chris Morris is knowing what's fact and what's fiction, as Mary Ann explains.
Chris Morris is defined in no small part by mythology. I remember at Radio 1 it was rumoured that he'd send 6-page faxes calling the management spineless wankers if they threatened to edit his work. He was also alleged to have released helium into a news studio when he worked in local radio so that the newsreader would sound like a squashed hamster when he read his bulletin.
For the final edition of the first series of Blue Jam, Chris had edited the speech that the Archbishop of Canterbury made at the funeral of Princess Diana, so it sounded like he'd said awful things about the royal family. Radio 1 controller Matthew Bannister had forbidden Chris to broadcast that part of the programme. But the story goes that Chris decided to put it out anyway. But someone had to fade it out live on air in order not to cause offence. But Matthew isn't sure that's the real story.
I know that there is a tape now in existence where that programme starts and gets going and then the Archbishop's speech begins and then is faded out. I don't believe that was ever broadcast because I think A, I would have known about it because somebody would have drawn it to my attention, and B, if it had been faded out in that way, somebody would have had to be there who knew that I'd banned that from being broadcast. And it would have just been a studio manager on shift playing out the programme, and they wouldn't have known that that part of the programme should be faded out. So I think the most plausible explanation is that Chris Morris has circulated a version of the tape with that bit faded out, or at some point put together a version of the tape with that bit faded out as a kind of two fingers to me.
Here she comes, being wheels on a trolley. Mary Ann Hobbs being wheels on a trolley. Every corner of her great big head is supported by a wooden buttress. And when she smiles, it looks like an exploding pig. All the children watch screaming from the bar. From the air is full of ballies. Ballies cover her up with a top,
Tim Worthington has more on Blue Jam.
There were sketches about things like a doctor who really didn't care what his patients' ailments were, a doctor who cured people by kissing them. There were an American couple who entered their baby in baby fighting tournaments, all kinds of monologues about weird, disturbing things about people jumping into polar bear enclosures at the zoo. There were the unflustered parents who weren't really that bothered when the house started burning down. There were the bad sex sketches, which seemed obscene on the surface, but when you actually listen to them, they're just full of nonsense, delivered in the style of an outrageous porn movie, which made you think you were a lot more shocked by them than you were.
Could you?
Yeah?
Yeah? Could you whack my bonobo? Oh, yeah. Come on, whack my bonobo. Oh, come on, whack my bonobo.
Push your balls up my nose. Cackle my Gladys. Oh, cackle my Gladys. Oh, cackle my Gladys. Oh, more feeble granddad. Oh, more feeble granddad. Introduce me to Gladstone.
Hello! Yeah, now, disagree with my balls. Disagree! Really argue! Object! Object! gonna do with my leg?
And because it was Radio 1, there was some spoof club news, voiced by longtime Morris collaborator Michael Alexander St. John.
Clubs? This weekend? All right. OK, beach flies. Some truly hexagonal dope on this weekend at the bop sheds and flash tunnels. Right? Oh no, that's ridiculous. Right. Loads of noise breaking out over Yorkshire, mainly due to DJ Amil Rightmate, featuring some nice trad garage at the Salty Gob in Leeds. He uses guns, by the way, and there's no floor in the club at all. Bit of a clash in Hull, with the Fabatoire and the Bauble right next door to each other. At the Fab, it's the Comical Beggars with two nervous guitarists doing strum and bass, while the Borb have DJ Guts featuring the classic sounds of the 7th of January 1998. I'll always remember going absolutely bald to that brilliant Sister Wendy remix of My Fly Had Puppies by Borborygmus.
Now, Chris Morris is very media shy, but in 2010 he spoke to presenter of the Theory of Everything podcast, Ben Walker, about Blue Jam.
Well, I really enjoyed it, and Blue Jam felt like a noise, so radio was the obvious place for it. I mean, it really did feel like a sort of misty noise. So
it just seems like a medium that really works well for someone like you, with the wanting to carve out this space to do things on your own terms.
I do enjoy the process of radio, and even when I'm sort of having to edit, like the sound for a trail or something, anything that I've got Pro Tools shunting around or whatever. There's a kind of an allure to that.
It's still at the sort of the bottom of the food chain when it comes to media flower bed. You have radio at the bottom, and it's sort of looked down upon.
Yeah, but why look at it as a hierarchy? I mean, it honestly isn't. I mean, it is if you see that the media is a career ladder.
Well, it's treated it that way. I mean...
Yeah, but I think that's an advantage too, because it means that you can quietly get on with things without people worrying. I mean, yeah, if you... Clearly you are status obsessed, and therefore if you wear your radio badge, you'll be, at the back of the party with no one paying any interest. But, maybe that's the best place to be sometimes.
Kids' party's always a bit of a nightmare. So I just thought I'd hire a girl to fire ping pong balls out of her fanny. For the dads, really. Kids don't seem to mind.
Ben Walker again.
Is this a medium that you think one day of returning to, or?
I mean, I think of it frequently, but I suppose I do hound myself with the idea that the idea has to be right. But I think that's possibly an evasion strategy. I mean, maybe I should just get stuck in and do it, But it's sort of, you do have to have the impetus to want to do it. My anxiety nightmares are not sitting an exam and not knowing what to write. They're sitting in a radio studio and not knowing what to say. So you don't want to actually make
DJ
that come alive.
It's
a completely, right? So I mean, it's quite a good, really basic. It shows I've got a very basic, simple functioning brain that roughly understands predicaments in a simple binary way.
Blue Jam is often held up in the radio industry as one of the most challenging and accomplished pieces of broadcasting ever made by Radio 1. But why did the BBC run the risk of repeatedly putting Blue Jam on air? Former Radio 1 controller Matthew Bannister explains.
Well, because he's one of the greatest talents working in British broadcasting. So I was proud of 99.999% of what Chris Morris did on my radio station. And I still think that the shows that I commissioned from him are the shows I am most proud of having commissioned. Of anything that I've ever commissioned, and I've commissioned a lot, because they represent a leap forward in the medium of radio, and nobody else before or since has achieved anything like it.
Blue Jam, Blue Jam, Blue Jam.
So there you have it, the story of Radio 1 comedy in the 90s. In the pre-social media world of the 1990s, these shows transformed not just the way people thought about comedy, it gave young audiences a place to hear their worldviews reflected back at themselves, but funnier and slightly more twisted via the comedy shows on Radio 1. With Mary Whitehouse Experience, Armando Iannucci, Leon Herring's Fist of Fun, and Blue Jam, 4 hugely influential comedy shows that ran on Radio 1. All of whom transitioned to TV in some form and made household names of their stars. If you want to hear full episodes of these hilarious comedy shows, tune in to BBC Radio 4 Extra every night this week at 10. Find out more at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4 Extra. I'm Scott Mills. Thanks for listening.
Coming up on BBC Radio 1 Vintage. From 11, John Peel. Right now, it's Marianne Hobbs.